Good morning, sixth grade. So we're going to start on chapter 24, lesson 4, which is World War I brings change.
Lesson 4. World War I brings change. It matters because the agreement that ended World War I sowed the seeds for unrest. Post-war countries faced major changes within their own governments. Peace at last. Guiding question. What changes came to Europe and the Middle East after World War I? In late 1917, the Allies were in great need of American help. Years of trench warfare had worn out their armies. When American soldiers began arriving in Europe, Allied hopes soared. About the time the United States entered the war, Russia pulled out. As a result, German troops on the Eastern Front were moved west, and a larger German army advanced on Paris in 1918. On June 1st, American and French troops stopped the Germans' advance. In late September, the Americans began their own massive attack and broke through the enemy lines. Meanwhile, Austria-Hungary was close to collapse, and the Ottoman Turks surrendered. Revolt in Germany forced the emperor to step down. On November 11, 1918, Germany signed an armistice, or ceasefire, ending the war. Effects of the war. World War I had many destructive effects. Towns and farms were destroyed. Nearly 9 million soldiers had been killed, and another 21 million wounded. About 13 million civilians had died from starvation or disease. Some civilians were killed deliberately. During the war, Ottoman officials were furious at what they believed was Armenian support for the Allies. Their anger led them to kill hundreds of thousands of Armenians in a terrible genocide. Genocide is the deliberate killing of an ethnic group. Peace talks. In January 1919, peace talks began at the Palace of Versailles outside Paris. The major figures at the talks were U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, French Premier Georges Clemenceau, and Italian Prime Minister Vittorio Orlando. Wilson presented a plan called the 14 Points. It stated that national groups in Europe should form their own countries. It also called for a League of Nations, an organization in which member nations would work to prevent future wars. The Treaty of Versailles focused on the Germans. Under the treaty's terms, Germany owed the Allies billions of dollars in reparations, or payments for war damages. Germany had to give up some territory in Europe as well as its overseas colonies. The treaty greatly reduced Germany's armed forces. The treaty also called for the creation of a League of Nations. President Wilson tried to win support at home for the treaty and the League. He failed, however, to get the U.S. Senate to approve the treaty. Many senators feared the League might force the country to fight in more foreign wars. As a result, the U.S. did not join the League of Nations. How was Europe's map redrawn? The Allies signed separate peace treaties with the other Central Powers. The war and the treaties that followed changed Europe's political borders. The German and Russian empires lost territory, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire disappeared completely. The lands from these three empires became new nation-states or parts of existing ones. The idea of self-government influenced many decisions at the Paris peace talks. However, the treaties were not able to draw national borders neatly, so that all people of a single ethnic group could be within one country. As a result, almost every new country in Eastern Europe had a dominant group and many smaller groups. As time passed, disputes between the different groups made these countries very unstable. The Ottoman breakup. In making peace, the Allies broke up the Ottoman Empire. Only the area of present-day Turkey was left to the Ottomans. In 1919, Greece invaded Turkey. Turkish armies led by General Mustafa Kemal drove out the Greeks and overthrew the Ottoman Sultan. Turkey became a republic in 1923. Kemal was soon called Ataturk, or Father of the Turks. As Turkey's first president, Ataturk worked to make Turkey a modern country. He reformed the legal code and reduced the influence of Islamic religion on government. A new Middle East. The Allies divided up the Ottoman Arab lands. France took Syria and Lebanon. Britain gained Iraq, Palestine, and Jordan. These new territories were called mandates. The League of Nations held each mandate, but allowed a member nation to run it. The Arabs felt no loyalty to the foreign-ruled mandates. They did, however, have a strong sense of Arab nationalism. In the 1920s, the leader Ibn Saud united most of the Arabian Peninsula. In 1932, he founded the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The new nation was at first very poor. Then U.S. businesses struck oil along the Persian Gulf, and Saudi Arabia grew wealthy.
Meanwhile, in the Palestine Mandate, Jews and Arabs came into conflict. In the late 1800s, Jewish nationalists called Zionists settled in the region. They wanted to build a homeland where the ancient Israelites had formed a kingdom many centuries earlier. In 1917, Britain issued the Balfour Declaration. It promised Jews a homeland in the Palestine Mandate. Arabs, who made up most of the Mandate's people, were outraged. To satisfy the Arabs, the British limited entry of Jewish settlers to the Palestine Mandate. Reading Progress Check. Determining Cause and Effect. What effects did the Treaty of Versailles have on Europe's population? Connections to today. Veterans Day. World War I ended on November 11, 1918. The following year, President Wilson declared November 11th a national holiday called Armistice Day. Other nations soon followed Wilson's lead. In 1954, in the United States, Armistice Day was renamed Veterans Day to honor those who served and fought in World War I, World War II, and the Korean War. Today, we still honor veterans of all our armed forces on Veterans Day. Revolution in Russia. Guiding question. Why did revolution break out in Russia during World War I? During World War I, Russia was an ally of Britain and France. However, the war worsened problems inside of Russia. Russia's ruler, Tsar Nicholas II, was unable to deal with these problems. As a result, the Russian people turned against his rigid rule.
Unrest in Russia. During the early 1900s, many Russians were discontented. Peasants had little land, but paid high taxes. Groups such as the Jews and the Poles were often mistreated. In 1905, Russia lost a war with Japan. The conflict cost Russia land and money. The Tsar was blamed for these losses. Following a workers' uprising in 1905, the Tsar allowed a Duma, or parliament, to meet. The Duma, however, had only limited powers. The Tsar shut down the Duma when it tried to act independently. Fall of the Tsar. Russia had fewer industries than the other powers in World War I. As a result, its military did not have enough supplies and suffered high casualties. Civilians also faced food and fuel shortages. In March 1917, striking workers demanding peace and bread flooded the streets of St. Petersburg. Soldiers in the city refused to fire on the protesters, calling for the Tsar's removal. Finally, the Tsar gave up his throne. He and his family were later executed. Members of the Duma then set up a temporary government, focused mainly on the war effort. As a result, it did not carry out reforms at home and lost the support of many Russians. Who is Lenin? Many Russian workers felt that the government favored the middle class, or those with wealth. They set up committees, called Soviets, to represent their concerns. Soon the Soviets and the government began competing for control of the country. The The Soviets were made up of workers and peasants from different socialist groups. As socialists, they wanted workers to create a society based on equality for all. The most radical group was the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks believed that they could use force to bring about this ideal society. Their leader was Vladimir Lenin. The Bolsheviks vowed to take Russia out of the war, give all land to the peasants, and put the Soviets in charge of the government. In October 1917, the Soviets in Russia's two largest cities, St. Petersburg and Moscow, were under Bolshevik control. As a result, the Bolsheviks were in a position to seize the government. In November 1917, the Bolsheviks captured St. Petersburg's Winter Palace, which was the location of the temporary government. The government fell with little bloodshed. Lenin became the head of a new government. Russia's Civil War. In early 1918, Lenin made peace with Germany and gave up large areas of Russia's empire. Meanwhile, Russia slipped into a civil war between the Bolsheviks, now called Communists, the Reds, and their political opponents, the Whites. Communist leader Leon Trotsky organized the Red Army to defend the communist government. The Whites promised to defeat the Reds and bring Russia back into World War I. As a result, the Allies sent them aid. This aid did little to help the Whites. Instead, it stirred Russian patriotic support for the Communists. During the 3-year conflict, both the Reds and the Whites burned villages and killed civilians. In 1921, the Whites gave up. Lenin and the Communists now controlled all of Russia. Progress check. Explaining. What role did the Soviets play in the Russian Revolution?